At the end of January 2019, two 9-year-old schoolgirls, while returning home, accidentally stumbled upon a human hand, not far from house number 2 in the Berezovka district of Khabarovsk. Shocked, they hurried to tell their parents about it. They immediately contacted the police, and on the same day, law enforcement found parts of a man's body in the trash bin indicated by the girls. The identity of the victim was soon established. It turned out to be 57-year-old janitor Vasily Shlyakhtik, who had disappeared a few days earlier. Neighbors recognized him by his distinctive mustache. Vasily was last seen on January 28, 2019, when he received his salary and handed over the keys to his room to an acquaintance. On January 29th, no one was able to contact him, and on the 30th, after the gruesome discovery, the reasons for his silence became clear. In his last days, Vasily spent time in a rented room on the second floor of house number 2, where Sofia Zhukova lived, who was considered a troublemaker and a scandalous person in the neighborhood. The public was shocked when they learned that the years-long search for a serial killer led to an elderly woman. Sofia Zhukova committed her first murder at the age of 66, and her last at 80. Neighbors, knowing the truth about the fillings in her pies, would surely have refused the treat. But let's go in order. Who is Sofia Zhukova? Sofia Zhukova was born in 1939 in the Nizhny Novgorod region. She couldn't boast of an education and worked in simple labor positions. Later, she moved to Khabarovsk, where she got a job at a pig farm and was involved in slaughtering livestock. She settled in the village of Berezovka, which later became part of Khabarovsk. There, she got married and had 2 sons. Neighbors remembered her as a grumpy woman who disliked children, despite having her own. If anyone in the building laughed or made noise, Zhukova would start threatening in her hoarse voice, "I'll chop everyone up." But who would take the threats of an elderly woman seriously? The Zhukov family's life was peaceful until 2005 when Sofia's husband passed away. Perhaps he kept her aggression in check, or his death unhinged her mind. We will never know for sure. Nevertheless, the elderly woman began openly clashing with neighbors, threatening violence. But as I mentioned, no one took her threats seriously. However, in that same year, 2005, she committed her first crime. She killed an 8-year-old neighbor girl, Masha Dmitrieva. This was only the beginning of her nightmarish story of 3 lost souls. No one suspected Zhukova of the murders until traces of blood were found in her apartment and on the stairwell. It is worth noting that Sofia was physically strong. During her arrest, she was able to resist 5 police officers. Of course, if she went so strong, she probably wouldn't have lasted at the pig farm. The first victim. On December 14th, 2005, Masha Dmitrieva disappeared without a trace. Masha was returning from school with a friend. At the entrance to the building, the girls said goodbye, and Masha calmly went home. Zhukova entered the building right after her. The unsuspecting girl began to climb to the 2nd floor. But she never made it home. On December 27th, a driver from Khabarovsk, having made a forced stop at the local dump, noticed a black bag. Peeking inside, he discovered pieces of meat. Not understanding what it was, the man decided to take it with him to feed the dogs. But once in the apartment, he saw what he had actually brought. Overcoming his fear, he called the police and reported his discovery. After conducting investigative activities, Masha's mother confirmed that the remains belonged to her daughter. The driver was interrogated for a long time, but was released as his words were confirmed by those close to him. The murder shocked the city, but the perpetrator was not found at that time. On the day the girl disappeared, the police questioned the neighbors, including Zhukova. The woman was polite, speaking of Masha as a good child who loved to visit her and draw. She claimed she last saw the girl when she entered the building ahead of her, but then, according to her, Masha's friends called her, and she ran outside. Zhukova's story puzzled Masha's relatives, who knew that the girl never visited her. On the contrary, the woman often yelled at her when she played in the building or the yard. But no one could explain Zhukova's strange behavior at the time. The crime could have been solved on the day the girl disappeared. Zhukova's neighbor, who was walking her dogs, noticed pieces of meat under her balcony. Thinking it was the work of dog hunters, she left, reporting the find to the police. However, the officers did not see anything suspicious in it. Later, Zhukova admitted that she hoped the dogs would scatter Masha's remains. But either the animals didn't like that kind of meat, or they weren't hungry, because the killer's expectations were not met. The second victim. Over time, life in the village returned to normal, and the tragic event was gradually forgotten. However, in 2013, another mysterious disappearance occurred in Berezovka. This time, Zhukova's friend, 77-year-old Anastasia Mikiva, disappeared. The retiree had sold her apartment in Khabarovsk and planned to move to her daughter's place in Moscow while the paperwork was being processed, and she temporarily stayed with Zhukova. Anastasia was last seen on March 9th, when the postman delivered the pensions. Both went in. The next day, Mikiva disappeared. Her daughter and niece filed a missing person report, and investigators began reconstructing the timeline of events. According to their version, the women had an argument on March 9th. Mikiva wanted to urgently leave for her relatives in Primorai, but Zhukova, trying to stop her, took away her documents. During the argument, according to Zhukova, Mikiva's nose started bleeding, and as she gestured, she splattered it on the wall. Then Mikiva allegedly ran outside and got into a black car, which drove off in an unknown direction. The investigators did not believe Zhukova's version. There were too many inconsistencies in her story. Mikiva's relatives claimed that she had no connections in Primorai. A mail carrier, who visited Zhukova again a month later, said that she started talking about the black car that took Mikiva away, even though the windows of her apartment faced the courtyard, not the street. Neighbors also noticed that after Mikiva's disappearance, Zhukova started wearing her clothes and taking furniture to the dump. Moreover, she began offering meat pies to the neighbors, even though she had never been hospitable before. One of the neighbors recalled that this seemed strange. She had always been gloomy and withdrawn from. And then suddenly she offered meat pies. Another resident, who knew Zhukova personally, added she always offered meat dishes. Once she brought a plate of aspic. My husband said it smelled bad, and we threw it away. It seems we did it just in time. However, it was not possible to gather evidence of Zhukova's involvement in Mikhaev's disappearance. She was questioned and then released. The third victim. Her own. Sofia Zhukova committed her last murder at the age of 80. A new tenant appeared in her apartment. The janitor Vasily Shlyakhtik was 57 years old. The man was a newcomer from Ukraine, had a steady job, and loved to drink, quite often in fact. Tired of his endless drinking, his partner kicked him out of the house. Vasily had nowhere to go, so he rented a room from his acquaintance named Sofia Zhukova. If he had known how it would turn out, he would have looked for shelter in another, safer place. On January 28, 2019, the man disappeared. According to neighbors, on the eve of Victor's disappearance, very strange muffled thuds were heard from the neighbor's apartment. Something hard. One of the neighbors claimed to have heard a man scream, which was drowned out by the blows of a heavy object. The next morning, the neighbors encountered Zhukova at the trash bin. She was holding a thick bag with something very heavy inside. However, the sounds of the heavy object did not end there. That evening, the neighbors heard those sounds again. As it later turned out, Zhukova was dismembering a corpse. And a day later, children found a dog gnawing on a human hand. In the trash bin itself, investigators found what was left of the janitor Shlyakhtik. Only then did they pay attention to Zhukova, brought her in for questioning, and conducted a thorough search of her apartment. What the investigators found shocked them. The apartment of the seemingly harmless old lady was spattered with blood, and a bloody axe was found in the closet. The investigation quickly established a connection between Shlyaktika's disappearance and the neighbors' testimonies. The janitor's former partner identified the deceased, and Sofia Zhukova was detained. During the search of her apartment, investigators found multiple traces of Victor's blood, including on the axe blade. Zhukova refused to take the blame and presented her version of events. According to her, she was not acquainted with Victor. She claimed she was using the axe because she was chopping bones to make borscht that night. The blood on the wall, she claimed, was left by Alavtina, who left 7 years ago. As for Victor's fate, she allegedly had no idea. This story was deemed unreliable, and Zhukova was arrested. A few days later, she presented a new version. She indeed did not know the man, but she met him the night before when he and a friend came over to have tea. Sofia agreed, but during the tea, the men raped her. One of them ran away, but Victor refused to leave, and then Zhukova used the axe, as she explained, to protect her honor and dignity. The new version was accepted for consideration, but the investigation continued. Investigators suggested that the janitor's murder might be connected to previous cases. Additional interviews were conducted, witnesses were questioned, and thorough searches were carried out in the apartment, during which bloodstains belonging to Alevtina were found under the linoleum. The British tabloid Mirror reported that human organs were found in the woman's freezer, although this fact was officially denied by the investigative committee staff. Investigation. Sofia Zhukova was arrested on suspicion of murder. However, even there, the elderly woman managed to intimidate the seasoned women, who had serious crimes in their past. And not just one. They were afraid to sleep in Sofia's presence, fearing that the elderly woman might snap at any moment and deal with her cellmates. According to the staff of the detention center and law enforcement officers, the pensioner behaved extremely provocatively, raising her voice at the slightest disagreement and making threats. And she insulted them. One day, Zhukova's cellmates shared with the detention center staff that the elderly woman had opened up to them and talked about the murders. Lena and Alevtina, although before that she claimed that they were trying to accuse her of the janitor's murder. A few days later, Zhukova gave a confession. She described each of the acts in detail, explaining the motives behind her actions. Sofia believed that Alevtina was behaving too arrogantly. On the day she received her pension, the woman struck her friend with an axe, dismembered the body, and took it out to the trash in several bags. The same thing happened with Victor, but the reason was purely domestic. During a drinking session, the retiree dealt with her tenant. Little Lena was deprived of life because she was careless, playing under Zhukova's windows and making noise. Once, the woman reprimanded the girl, but in response, according to her, she got ice cream thrown in her face. After some time, the elderly woman would retract her statements, claiming she was pressured. But that will no longer matter, as the investigators will have already gathered enough evidence to charge Zhukova. However, the murderer will not be destined to answer for their crimes. Causes and consequences. Telia Vergazova is a senior investigator in the Department for Investigating Particularly Important Cases of the Investigative Committee of Russia for the Khabarovsk Territory and the Jewish Autonomous Region. During her service in the Investigative Department for Khabarovsk, she was involved in the investigation of the murder of Shlyaktik. According to her, Zhukova was not immediately detained because, at the time of the first two murders, there was not enough evidence to implicate her. However, as evidence accumulated and the woman's own confessions were taken into account, the investigative authorities had no doubt about her involvement in the crimes, including the murder of Masha Dmitrieva. Vergazova explained that one of the decisive factors was that Zhukova was the last person seen entering the building with the girl, as confirmed by neighbors' testimonies. An important element of the investigation also included information about the conflict between Zhukova and the deceased, the threats the pensioner made against her, as well as the accused's own confession, which significantly strengthened the evidence base. The reasons that drove Sofia Zhukova to deal with Makiva and Shlyaktik lie in domestic conflicts. After she took the lives of her victims, the pensioner dismembered the bodies and, after packing them in bags, disposed of the remains by either throwing them into trash containers near her home or in remote corners of Berezovka. To dispose of the bodies, she made several trips outside her home. The forensic psychological and psychiatric examination found her to be sane, determining that she committed all the murders consciously and fully understood her actions. Adelia Vergazova claimed that the crimes were caused by minor incidents, which reflects the pensioner's hot-tempered and uncontrollable nature. After studying her biography and behavior, the investigative authorities concluded that she was not involved in any other crimes besides these three murders. In Russia, women are not sentenced to imprisonment in high-security and special regime colonies. However, having gathered sufficient evidence, the investigation was confident that the 80-year-old criminal would spend the rest of her life in prison. Only 3 victims. While Sofia Zhukova was behind bars, the fear of her did not subside. Among the residents of Berezovka, during her time in the village, several people disappeared at once. One of the most mysterious cases occurred on September 10, 2000. In 2017, when 80-year-old Nina Babenkova, who went out for a walk with her dog, never returned home. Dozens of volunteers, as well as dog handlers and conscript soldiers, participated in the search for the elderly woman. Despite all efforts, Nina Babinkova's trail disappeared several miles from her home, and the dog she left with was found exhausted. The animal was missing its leash, and instead, there was only a frayed nylon rope, which could indicate that someone tied it up and later released it. Or the dog might have escaped on its own after chewing through the rope. At the end of 2018, during a search in the forest belt, residents of Berezovka stumbled upon a human skull. Forensic experts confirmed that it most likely belonged to the missing Nina. However, the rest of her remains were never found. This case was just one of many, and once again, there were talks in the village that the disappearances might be connected to Zhukova's actions. Residents suspect that her crimes were much more brutal than initially thought, and she might have truly deserved her demise.